Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for those of you who joined us late. Our first speaker is Peter LaVenia Jr. Peter is the co-chair of the Green Party of New York and is an assistant professor of political science at SUNY Oneonta. He's written and commented extensively on politics and foreign policy in journals such as Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, Counterpunch, Jacobin, and the New York Daily News. Just want to encourage people to put your questions in the chat and please stay mute.
So I want to talk briefly about the history of international law. Um, when we look at the development of international law in the West, we really have to go back to the medieval period in the time when there were conflicts between professional aristocratic armies of knights. When you look at something like, medieval dramas, we do have to understand that there were rules of conflict and there were rules of how to treat civilians in conflict. This wasn't just a free-for-all. The aristocracy had a couple of principles that they agreed upon, mostly even if there weren't big covenants. They agreed that if somebody surrendered in combat, that they shouldn't be killed summarily, so that people should be held as a POW and taken for ransom. This was usually a courtesy only granted to aristocrats. You shouldn't kill diplomats, right? So this is where the phrase "don't kill the messenger" comes from. It did happen, but it was considered to be a breach of the laws of war when it did happen, and usually it caused combatants to get very angry. Not killing civilians, right? This was actually part of a medieval code of ethics and in the laws of war. This was important if cities, which were often the focus of the conflict, taking these towns, surrendered, then you weren't supposed to kill or pillage the population. If they didn't surrender, then you had the right to do so. Okay. But let's remember that these conflicts were mostly between small armies of very professional soldiers. There weren't modern nation states, and their capacity to do a lot of damage usually was very limited. And so, for all these reasons, you don't have modern rules of warfare until about the 19th century. That's when the American Civil War happens, and many historians consider this to be really the first modern conflict. You have big mass conscription armies. They fight over a large area. They affect civilians and urban populations. So you have all these things that we start to see in the 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries coming into play, right? And so in 1863, a political scientist named Franz Lieber is asked by the Union Army to develop kind of a code of war that the Army could then abide by, or at least try to abide by. And so there are certain things that the Lieber Code talks about that then inspire other laws of war that I'll talk about briefly. So it's 157 articles. You can go and read it. It talks about how to treat POWs. It talks about prohibiting things like poisoning or torture, and it defines, what is actually militarily necessary in war, right? So this idea of total warfare is starting to be developed, right? What does it mean? Is it something that should be allowed? Um, we don't really get international codification. This is something that the United States developed for another couple of decades. You get two meetings of European powers to talk about rules of war at the end of the 19th century, just before World War I. Two meetings in the Netherlands at The Hague in 1899 and 1907. And this is when they start to talk about what should and shouldn't be prohibited, the rules of war, laws of war, and war crimes, right? This is when they start to say, we're going to sign on to this and we're going to agree to abide by it, at least allegedly, right? It is, however, after World War II that we get the modern definition of war crimes with the Geneva Conventions. These are signed in 1949, and they are an attempt to prevent the atrocities of World War II, or at least that's their stated goal. I think we're going to talk about the reality of things like the Geneva Conventions versus what they purport to do. So there are four international treaties, and there are three additional protocols that were developed in 1949 and to a certain extent afterwards. And some countries have signed on to all the additional protocols. The U.S. has only signed on to one of them. We can talk about that later. The first convention talks about soldiers when they're wounded in the field or at sea. The second one is prisoners of war. The third convention talks about civilians, and there are kind of additional ones that talk about other stuff, like I said. Um, so these create an obligation to the signers to abide by them, even if other powers engaged in war are not, right? So in previous eras, if somebody decided they weren't going to abide by a certain rule of conflict, then the other side could simply say, we don't. We don't have to do this anymore. Somebody else is killing our civilians. We're just going to go ahead and do whatever we want and be as terrible as possible. Theoretically, the Geneva Conventions say if you've signed on, then no matter what other people do, what other countries do, you have to abide by these rules. Not only that, but the Geneva Conventions say that the signatories are supposed to uphold these rules if other countries are not abiding by them, which is why you've heard about the Geneva Conventions in the last couple of years because of what's going on in Gaza, right? And the fact that when genocide is occurring, that people who have signed on to the Geneva Conventions and international law around it are supposed to step in to stop it, right? Um, but again, we're going to talk about the reality of these things versus what we hope they are. My part of this is to an extent to talk about what we would like them to be. And so when we look at the definition of war crimes, right, I think sometimes we have a very vague idea of what they actually mean, right? But when we look at the definition, there are some very specific things that war crimes talk about. I'm not going to go through all four articles of the Geneva Conventions, but I will say that when we talk about violations of the laws of war, we're talking about atrocities or offenses against people or their property, right? Murder, ill treatment, deportation to slave labor, right, of civilians in occupied territory. Um, Murder or ill treatment of prisoners of war or sailors. Um, Killing of hostages, torture or inhumane treatment, plunder of public or private property, wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages, any kind of devastation or attacks that are not strictly militarily necessary. So that's attacks on civilian targets, which we're going to get into. And destruction of property that is of particular cultural significance. So if you're bombing universities, if you're bombing places of worship, if you're bombing historical sites, right? This is considered a violation of the Geneva Conventions and a war crime. And there are other parts of this too, right? Things that we call war crimes more generally are defined by international law as something else technically. So the actual attack on Iran that happened at the end of February is actually what we call a crime of aggression or a crime against the peace. And this is planning, preparing, initiating, or waging a war in violation of treaties, agreements, or assurances. So essentially, if you're engaged in diplomacy, if you haven't been actually attacked or about to be attacked, then you have committed a crime, right? It's war crimes are what happen during war. A crime of aggression or a crime against peace is defined as starting that conflict. So what we've got in Iran, we're going to talk about is this crime of aggression, and it is also many, many war crimes, right? So these are two separate categories, but they are part of those conventions on war, right? Similarly, genocide is considered a war crime, or it's considered part of the Geneva Conventions. It's a corollary to the war crimes, and you have other things that are considered crimes against humanity, right? So mass murder or extermination, enslavement, deportation, systematic rape, persecutions of people on political, racial, or religious grounds. Um, so this is a lot, right? But this is all contained. This is kind of a summary of what's contained in those four big Geneva Conventions. And the U.S. is a signatory, right? And so the U.S. is supposed to uphold those principles technically. The reality is that the international law, as we'll see, is created to benefit the countries that are in charge in the system, right? They pay attention to them when they feel like it, and they ignore them when they don't, right? And so, as much as we would like this international law to hold, the U.S. has historically used international law to maintain its dominance over the world system. It has ignored it on many occasions when it's engaged in conflict because it's not expedient, right? It is particularly egregious in Iran. And of course, in Venezuela, what happened in January as well was a crime of aggression. And so I think that I want to talk to a certain extent about what we are discussing in Iran, right? And Margaret is going to talk more detail about this, but I do want to point out that there have been over 100 scholars that have come out and signed a letter and detailed the war crimes and crimes of aggression that have happened in Iran that the U.S. and Israel have perpetrated, right? That there are serious scholars who have come out and said that these things that the United States and Israel have done are serious breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and that the political leaders and the soldiers involved in the conflict in Iran, in Lebanon, and Gaza are war criminals, right? I mean, to engage in this are serious war crimes, right? So I'll just briefly talk about this. I'll let Margaret get into detail. So the fact that the strike was launched on Iran in the middle of negotiations, as I said, that's a crime of aggression. In fact, sometimes you'll hear the phrase perfidy thrown around, and that is when you essentially trick an enemy into thinking that you or a potential enemy that you are going to engage in some kind of diplomacy or not attack, and then you do it anyway. This also happened, by the way, over the last year in the Caribbean and with Venezuela, where the U.S. would come in and they painted planes to look like civilian planes, and then they bombed civilian ships in the Caribbean. And we know that they've gone back, and not only did they bomb them, but they've hit them again, right, to make sure that they were dead. Israel and the U.S. have attacked ambulances and doctors, people who are under the Geneva Conventions protected from attack, and they know that they've done this, right? This is a serious crime of aggression. It's also a breach of the UN Charter, by the way, which is another international law outside of the Geneva Conventions. Both Israel and the U.S. are members of the UN, and the UN Charter says you cannot go to war unless you are going to immediately be attacked, or the UN Security Council says that it's okay. And this did not happen, right? They were also attacking another member state, Iran. You're supposed to go to the United Nations to discuss your problems before conflict and then wait for a UN resolution. They just decided to go ahead and attack. So that's another breach. Um, so there are serious concerns about that, right? And the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has actually condemned those attacks because of it. We know that there have been strikes on civilian infrastructure, on civilian targets, right? So things like power plants, things like universities, things like schools, hospitals, civilian apartment complexes, houses. Again, you cannot target civilians in time of war, even if they're, quote, supposedly near military installations. It's still a war crime. You can't knowingly do this, right? They've attacked gas and other infrastructure, drilling infrastructure, desalination plants that people require for survival. In fact, the Iranian Red Crescent reported that 67,000 civilian sites have been struck, and this is between February 20th and March 23rd, 498 schools and 236 health facilities. So this isn't just one or two. This is systematic, right? These are systematic crimes. And of course, you've heard about the strike in the first day on the primary school in Manab that killed 175 people, most of them children, right? And this is the United States lied about it. They said that they said Iran bombed its own school, right? Remember when they were doing this in Gaza, where they claimed that the Gazans actually shot their own hospital, and now we know that the Israelis have done it.
Peter,
And
I'm
they've
going to just give you a slight, maybe 5 minutes, even
Yeah,
get it
thank you,
on a
thank you.
bit, but
Um, so we know that's the case. We know that the school was being used, that building was being used as a school for over a decade. The U.S. and Israel had to know that. They did it on purpose. That's a war crime. We know that the rhetoric that the Trump administration has been using constitutes a breach of the Geneva Convention. So Pete Hegseth has been talking about giving no quarter, right? You're not going to take any prisoners. That's illegal. That's a war crime. You cannot tell your troops to shoot surrendering soldiers, right? The same thing with Donald Trump, where he's talking about the fact he doesn't need international law, that on March 13th, he said that he might just attack Iran for fun, or the fact that he threatened to take out power plants, nuclear plants, and of course, the fact that he threatened genocide to wipe out the entire Iranian civilization, right? These are war crimes. So uh, we also know that they're kind of moving to abolish any kind of safeguards here in the U.S. in the military and in the military code against these kind of war crimes. That's another serious problem, right? Um, so, I have 5 minutes, so I don't want to take too much time, but I think this is a continued problem. It's not just the U.S. that does this, right? I mean, there are many, many other powers that do this, especially European powers, old colonial imperialist powers. They come up with these rules for themselves, and then when it concerns, countries that they believe they can or should dominate or have dominated, those rules don't apply when they don't feel like it, right? When they want to attack them. So when you talk about historically, I'll just go down the list. If we go back to the late 19th century, back when those Hague Conventions were being discussed, the U.S. Took over the Philippines right after the Spanish-American War, and the statistics are that they murdered 250,000 civilians during that conquest, right? Um, and there were many, many massacres. The occupation of Haiti by the United States from 1915 to 34, several thousand Haitians were killed by U.S. forces and their Haitian allies. We know that everybody calls World War II the Good War, right? And that is simply not the case for many reasons, especially in the Pacific Theater. The U.S. Gave no quarter to Japanese soldiers. They shot up lifeboats. They mutilated war dead. There was mass rape in many of the battles. The Korean War, this statistic is being thrown around, but we mass carpet bombed North Korea during the Korean War after we signed these Geneva Conventions, right? So the statistics are that we killed about 282,000 Korean civilians over the course of 3 years. This is a mass war crime, right? All of the American generals and politicians who were involved in that should have been put in front of a jury, and probably other things should have happened to them too, right? There was near starvation. We attacked dams that led to start near starvation of millions of North Korean civilians. If the Soviets and the Chinese hadn't stepped in, probably there would have been mass starvation in the North. Similarly with Vietnam, right? I mean, that's the war that went on for 20 years. We had hundreds of thousands killed, right? Probably in reprisals, free fire zones where if you were in it, you were shot. We probably have all heard about the My Lai
So
massacre,
I'm
right?
here.
In front of me, going to be put on the
I'm
commode
here.
that is in the
Okay. The My Lai massacre, which was stopped by actually American troops who were then essentially court-martialed for it, right? The fact that they stopped a war crime. The global war on terror, right? I remember Lindy England, and you remember Abu Ghraib, right? The sexual torture, the murder of civilians, and then more recently, the attacks on Venezuela civilians and what's going on in Iran. So, I mean, this is a systematic breach of international law when the United States and other imperial powers don't feel like using international law, they don't, right? They ignore it. And when they do, they can cry and they can say, "Oh, look at these countries; they're doing terrible things, right? But we've created these laws for our own benefit, right? It's not that they shouldn't be enforced. I think that they're important, right? But they are abused by the U.S. and other imperial powers when we feel like it, and that's what's happening here in Iran and Lebanon.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Margaret Kimberley. Margaret is a Green Party member and serves on the Green Party New York State Committee. She's executive editor and columnist for Black Agenda Report, and she belongs to the leadership bodies of the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition. She is the author of Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gloria. Thank you so much, Peter. Um, and thank you all for joining us. We're just on a human level, we're facing a very difficult time. I think that's been traumatic for anyone who has a sense of humanity, I'll put it that way. 2 years of more than 2 years of now of genocide in Gaza, which could not have happened without the support first of Joe Biden and now Donald Trump. We've seen the Trump administration this year kidnap. Peter mentioned the pretext for attacking Venezuela, that there were drug shipments, drug boats in the Caribbean, which they never provided any evidence of and were never asked by very few people who were in a position to ask. And then kidnapped the president and his wife, who are now in prison in Brooklyn, New York. So this is a very difficult moment for us, but that makes it important to know the history of U.S. Aggressions around the world. And I will share, well, actually, I'm not going to share just yet. So I wanted to talk about the history of U.S. aggression against Iran. Against the Islamic Republic of Iran is the official name of that state. Let's go back to 1953. Iran had elected, everyone talks about democracy and elections. Well, when countries elect someone who the U.S. doesn't like, well, they get rid of them. And Mohammad Mossadegh was elected in the early 50s. British Petroleum had a large stake in Iran. And so it was mostly a British-led effort, but of course, being a junior partner to U.S. imperialism, the U.S. assisted in undermining his government and sending Mr. Mossadegh into exile, and then installing the Shah of Iran. The Shah was a U.S. puppet for 25, I'm sorry, I'll just say starting in 1953 to 1979. And it was, so that's the first crime, the first act of aggression against Iran by the United States. And the point I'm trying to make is that this recent attack that began on February 28th is the culmination of years of aggression, U.S. aggression against Iran. So, for example, I started talking about Mr. Mossadegh, and I want to define the term war of aggression. It's something that's a term that's used very frequently, but it is not hyperbole. So I will just tell you, quote, "A war of aggression is a military conflict initiated without self-defense justification, often for territorial conquest, and is considered the supreme international crime. It violates the UN Charter and entails personal criminal liability for leaders defined by the International Criminal Court. Such actions involve unprovoked armed force, including invasion or bombardment against another state's sovereignty." And this is a perfect definition of what the U.S. and Israel have done. So when I say war of aggression, I'm not exaggerating. I started out talking about Mossadegh and the U.S. putting the Shah, their puppet, in power. But that was not the end of what the U.S. did in Iran. Now, you may remember, I don't know how old everyone is now, Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, was once a U.S. ally. And, if in the late 90s and early O's, all we heard was Saddam Hussein was the embodiment of evil. He was terrible. He was awful. And, that's not necessarily, that is true, but he was a U.S. friend. And with the support of the United States, he waged an 8-year-long war against Iran. And depending upon whom you listen to, at least 500,000 people died or 1 million people died. We know it was many thousands. And I'm going to try to share. That's never my strong point. Here you go. I hope you see this photo. The man on the left is Donald Rumsfeld. He was Ronald Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East. And the man on the right is Saddam Hussein. This photo was taken and there's some grainy video, in 1983. And this is just, and I share that with you as a reminder of this long history of U.S. interference and aggressions against Iran. And, you will recall that we were told the U.S. had to attack Iraq. And this is funny. I suppose you've heard of Henry Kissinger saying to be a friend of the United States is fatal, something along those lines. And Saddam Hussein certainly found that out. And we were told that he had weapons of mass destruction. He had chemical weapons. Well, he did. And he used them against Iranians. It's people in Iran who suffered from the time when Saddam Hussein did have chemical weapons. There was the United States Navy shot down a passenger plane, Iran Air Flight 655, on July 3rd, 1988, where? In the Straits of Hormuz. The USS Vincennes fired on this civilian plane. They said it was a mistake. In any case, 290 people were killed. The U.S. ultimately did pay some restitution to the families, but it took a long time for that to happen. We hear a lot about sanctions, and the more precise term is economic coercive measures. And what do sanctions actually do? I'll use the term sanction. It's what most people are familiar with. And we think it means you can't open a bank account in Tehran, Iran, or you can't open a bank account in Havana, Cuba. Well, you can't, but what it does is that it punishes a country by cutting that nation off from the world financial system. And the dollar is still the world reserve currency. So that, and now it's really terrible. They're sanctioning individuals who fall, ICC judges, for example, who can't open bank accounts, can't use their credit cards. And what does that mean for a nation? It means a nation like Iran can't buy medication, can't buy equipment for infrastructure, can't get anything that a country needs. Now, Iran is a somewhat industrial nation, and it does have oil, but the goal is to keep a country like Iran from even selling their oil. And what are the impact of sanctions? Well, there was a recent study which says that unilateral sanctions imposed from 1970 to 2021 are associated with an estimated 38 million deaths around the world. That includes Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea, Sudan. I know I'm leaving many countries out that have been sanctioned by the U.S. in an effort to crush their governments, in an effort to make people suffer and to punish countries whose only crime is that they don't do what the U.S. tells them to do, or they want to bring socialism, or they've overthrown a puppet government, or Israel doesn't like them. Although Israel and the U.S. are usually of one mind about who they do and don't like. In the case of that region, it's any country that may pose a threat to Israel being a major military power. And we've seen since the early O's, the independent Arab states, um, those who acted independently of the US, one by one being picked off. It's also related to the fall of the Soviet Union. Those nations were generally supported by the Soviets. So first we see Iraq. Then we see and this is bipartisan. So it's Republicans who destroy Iraq. It's Democrats, Obama destroying Libya. It's Syria. It was several administrations, Democratic and Republicans, before they finally hollowed out that country and succeeded in a coup. And the new president is from Al Qaeda. We were always told they were evil, they were terrible, but most of these jihadist groups act as proxies for the U.S. For all these years, we've been told that Iran could develop a nuclear weapon. The IAEA, the international agency which is responsible for inspections, has always said Iran does not have nuclear weapons. Iran does want to use nuclear power and can enrich uranium for that purpose. And Barack Obama, who I generally don't give any credit for, he signed it was called the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And it was signed by the US, the other permanent members of the UN Security Council. And in exchange for being inspected, in exchange for limiting how much uranium they enriched, the US withdrew some of its sanctions. This happened in 2015. But it didn't last long. Trump comes in 2018. He pulls the U.S. out of the JCPOA. Biden comes in. What does he do? He followed Trump and kept the U.S. out of the JCPOA. So I want to talk about how, in recent years, especially in the past year, how the U.S. has undermined Iran, the use of war propaganda against that country, with the goal of undermining that administration and undermining any desire of people in this country and around the world to defend Iran. So here is, let's see if I can share again successfully. This is a quote from Mike Pompeo, who was CIA director and who was also, hold on a minute, he was CIA director in the first Trump administration, and he was also here we go, I have this up, and he was also Secretary of State. And this is a quote from him, which is kind of crazy, from January. And it says, the Iran regime is in trouble. Bringing in mercenaries, which is a lie, is its last best hope. Riots in dozens of cities and the Basij under siege. 47 years of, coincidence, 47 years. But the last line is what I want to bring attention to. Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets, also to every Mossad agent walking beside them. Now, I find this interesting because people want to debate whether or not there was any outside influence in the unrest in Iran when Mike Pompeo confesses on Twitter that there was. And I'm also going to share with you it's a 2-minute video, if I can find it. This is not my strong point, but I feel like all right. I think here we go. Hold on. Sorry. All right. And I don't see it. Aha. Here we go.
Number one, in early January, Mossad and CIA assets armed radical opposition members in Iran to undertake an insurrection in which 3,000 people on all sides lost their lives. There's plenty of video evidence for that. Number two, that was turned into a fake massacre story by activist groups. And this was quoted as fact by Western mainstream media, although no evidence was provided. A simple investigation shows that every single one of these groups can be traced back to the US or its Five Eyes partners, such as the UK and Canada. Number three, the Western mainstream media started pushing the fake story by quoting from a group called Human Rights in Iran, which is not in Iran. It's from Virginia, home of the CIA, and it's financed by the NED, the CIA's soft power spin-off. Number four, the fake news was backed up by a group called the Center for Human Rights in Iran, which is also not in Iran. It's also in the US. Number five, another group, Iran International. We trace back to the UK. Six, then there was the International Center for Human Rights, which turned out to be in Canada. Number seven, still other sources backing the fake massacre story turned out to be supporters of Reza Pahlavi, Juan Guaido II, such as the one quoted by Time magazine. Number eight, the most quoted person on Western mainstream television is this lady, Masih Linejad, who said millions were massacred, millions. She's worked for many years as a full-time anti-Iran propagandist with financing from the NED and a salary from Voice of America. Number nine, the fake tale was further pushed by the Boromon Center for Human Rights, another group financed by the NED. And number 10, by Tavana, which was started by the US State Department and financed by USAID, a notorious group that disguises CIA politicking as aid. Now, those are the facts, but here's the key question. Why does every Western mainstream media group, not most, but every single one, hide these facts from their audiences? Delete the Western mainstream media. Find out the truth for yourself. Peace.
So I hope that wasn't too painful watching me struggle with that. But I think that I wanted you all to see that because it sums up, I think, in a shorter amount of time than if I had talked about it, why we have to be so careful when we are told that a certain country oppresses its own people or kills its own people. Who is the source? And many of these news stories would not even give a source. It would say sources say. Well, who's the source? That is a giveaway for war propaganda. And I want to show you. This is very short. The current Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent,
planning there in terms of
talking about what the U.S. did to disrupt Iran's economy. And hopefully I can do this faster.
and the impact there. Do sanctions actually work?
President Trump ordered Treasury and our OFAC division, Office of Foreign Asset Control, to put maximum pressure on Iran, and it's worked. Because in December, their economy collapsed. We saw a major bank go under. The central bank has started to print money. There is a dollar shortage. They are not able to get imports, and this is why the people took to the street. So this is economic statecraft. No shots fired, and things are moving in a very positive way here.
What are you planning there in terms of Iran? Impact there. Do sanctions actually work?
President Trump ordered Treasury and our OFAC division, Office of Foreign Asset.
Anyway, so that is those are just some of the things that I wanted to share with you about this ongoing forever war against Iran and why Well, another issue is China gets oil from Iran. China gets oil from Venezuela. These are attacks on China. The goal of the US is to surround, and this goes back many years. This is also bipartisan policy to attack China and to attack China first and then Russia to make sure that the US has no competitors. This is something written in many policy papers over the years. And I want to end by talking about the Green Party platform. What does it say? And I think many of us here are Greens. I am, Peter is. It's a Green Party event. And whatever else you think, you should know what the Green Party platform is on these issues. And it says on foreign policy, the United States is obligated to conform to the stipulations of the Constitution, which identifies all agreements as treaties that hold the authority of U.S. law. We recognize our government's obligation to take disputes with other nations or foreign bodies to the UN Security Council and General Assembly. The U.S. must recognize the sovereignty of nation states and their right of self-determination. The U.S. must recognize and abide by the authority of the UN General Assembly to act in a crisis situation. We urge our government to sign the International Criminal Court Agreement and respect the authority of that institution. The U.S. did not sign the ICC and passed a law saying if the ICC tries to prosecute any American, the U.S. will invade the Netherlands and free that person. Further in the platform, our government does not have any moral or legal right or justification to preemptively attack another nation. The only legitimate use of military force is to repel an actual attack on our country. So I'm going to wrap it up now. I just wanted everyone to be clear. I don't believe it's enough to be pro-peace or anti-war. We must be anti-imperialist because that is the only way to keep the U.S. in check, the rogue nation in the world. And I hope that was helpful in understanding just some of that history regarding the U.S. and another nation, in this case, Iran. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret. And thank you for ending with the Green Party of the United States platform on this. It's important for people to know. We're going to encourage people to continue to put questions in the chat, and I will start with one of them. I'm going to get Peter back here, maybe
I'm
by
here.
some amazing trick.
I'm here.
I think I just have to pin him, but I hadn't want to pin Margaret. How do I pin you both?
You should be able to click on us, and there's like a little three button thing on the right hand, and then I think you can just hit
Margaret
pin.
was pinned and then she disappeared. But I'm going to continue to practice right here live. There you go.
Okay. Are we pinned?
There you both are. And I will go away after reading the ones. So aside from the US's direct involvement in war crimes, what are the laws involved in sending arms to governments or insurgents committing war crimes? This, of course, means Israel, but also could include Ukraine, Syria. So I don't know if you each want to comment or...
Yeah, I can talk very briefly. I don't know if I know every single one, but the most famous one is that it's called the Leahy laws, essentially, and it prohibits the Department of State and Defense from giving any kind of training or military assistance to foreign armies if there's credible evidence that they've committed a gross violation of human rights. These are routinely ignored. Israel's been doing this since its inception, and we have been, providing them with aid. The Leahy law has been on the books for, I believe, about 40 years. But that is the big one, right? So if someone declares that there's something like this happening, that other countries are committing war crimes, we are supposed to halt that kind of thing immediately. And this is why American officials will talk around it when allies are committing war crimes. They want to just continue to give all of those arms and that support and the money to them. So the Leahy laws are the big one. There are others too. There are export control acts that say we can't sell weapons, right, even conventionally, to countries that do these things. We do it anyway. We ignore it, but they are on the books, and occasionally someone in Congress will talk about the Leahy laws. I haven't heard it very recently because the Democrats support this war in Iran and elsewhere in American imperialism as much as the Republicans do. But yes, you are right. There are American laws on the books that say you can't do this. Margaret, I don't know if you want to comment at all, but I'll stop
I
there.
think I'm glad you asked that question. Peter answered. The U.S. routinely violates international law. And no one makes a demand of the US and its friends, like the Europeans, the vassal states is what they are, in fact, who routinely violate international law. But there's no one to back it up, no one are willing to force the United States to stop these war crimes. And now, that's also not hyperbole. Collective punishment of a civilian population is a war crime. Period. So sanctions are war crimes. If you cut off Cuba's supply of oil and people and hospitals can't function and you kill people as a result, this is collective punishment of civilians. And it's an example of the violation of these laws. And as Peter said, they went through they periodically go through this theater of, we're going to vote on the Iran war, and they make sure there's one or two people who vote with the Republicans so they can say, oh, sorry, we couldn't get that vote in. So especially here in New York, our senators, especially Senator Schumer, are very much in favor of this war on Iran. And they criticize Trump from the right. His only criticism of Trump is that he didn't kill more people in Iran.
Absolutely. Yeah. 38 million, I think you said 38 million people dead because of US sanctions over the last 50 years. It's just an incredible number. It's disturbing and disgusting, but that's what we do. We're an imperial power. We do what we want and we kill people. You saw, I think you brought it up just now. The vote failed to pass the War Powers resolution in the House by one vote, one Democrat, right? They found one Democratic vote. He's a person who's retiring at the end of the year. And so he can be thrown to the wolves and everybody can hate him and, oh, it's his fault, but it's all theater. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. It just reminded me going back from the Iraq War in 2003 with a number of Greens going to a quote unquote anti-war forum in Brooklyn in Park Slope with Jerry Nadler and a bunch of other quote unquote progressive Democrats pretending and myself and another Green being removed from the auditorium by screaming how many children they had killed with sanctions over the years.
Yeah.
Just a fun fact. And here's another fun fact from one of our participants. The US, Britain, Canada, France, West Germany, and their allies all supported the Shah's ouster, thinking the Ayatollah Khomeini would be a good ally to them as he was going to eradicate the left and far left. But the moment he was hostile to Israel, vowed a global Shia conservative revolution and vowed the end of exploiting of Iran's oil, that was when the West turned and tried to use Saddam Hussein to crush the Islamic Republic. And then guess what? While the West supported Iraq during the Iraq War, Israeli supported the Islamic Republic because they thought Iraq was too pro-Palestinian. So what's your response to this? And does this show we need an Yves Engler's ethos in international relations, which is first, do no harm?
Margaret, do you want to go ahead?
I have to admit, not being familiar with that, so I can't agree with it or dispute it. But these countries are, they're not very loyal, as Saddam Hussein's ghost could tell you. So I would not be surprised if they made some of those calculations. And in the early days, the Islamic Republic did destroy leftists. I mean, people were executed in mass who were members of the Communist Party, for example. So I know that is true. So there may have been a point where they saw the writing on the wall. They couldn't keep the Shah, and maybe they figured, yeah, maybe we can cut a deal with this new guy. But if there was any support, it did not last for very long.
Great. Great, thanks. We have a couple more questions. Margaret, this is one is for you. Is please talk about China and the ongoing U.S. enrichment and how the government, U.S. government, says we have to go to war with China. So moving on to another country, but all important.
Yeah, there was a senator who, Rick Scott of Florida, who was quoted as saying, if China can't get any oil, it'll crash their economy, and that'll be the best thing in the world. Um, and that sums up what the U.S. China is an economic competitor of the U.S. And not only do they, have tariffs and keep us from being able to buy the best electric cars, in the world, USians would ditch every other electric car if they could get their hands on BYD, Build Your Dream, I think it stands for. So their goal is to try to encircle China by cutting off its oil supply from Venezuela or Iran, or building U.S. military bases in the Philippines, very close to China, or stirring up trouble with via proxies in surrounding Asian countries. So all of these things are meant to weaken China and actually to go to war against China, which does not have the military the U.S. has. And so the U.S. can snatch the president of Venezuela. China's far away. They don't have all these bases. That's another thing we need to be against, the U.S. having hundreds of military bases all over the world. But China is the number one target. It could be Venezuela, it could be Iran, but dig just not even very deep, and you see an effort to destabilize China.
All right. Peter, did you want to comment at all, or?
Yeah, I think Margaret is spot on there. I think that the long game here is that it's an attack on China. It's an attack on any country that tries to break out from U.S. and Western domination. Yeah, we have between 750 and 1,000 military bases around the world, depending on how you count them. We're the only country that has that many. In fact, there's only, I think, between everybody else, 20 foreign military bases around the world, right? When you combine everybody else's. So we are the imperial power, and I think that you have to see these other countries. Margaret used, I think, you used the term vassals. I mean, I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, they are capitalist countries that are tied into the big one, and they know where their bread is buttered, and so they are going to take orders from the U.S. as long as it's very profitable for them. And right now, that's what they're doing. And Iran, has been designated as an enemy and as an ally of China, and so they're willing to do what it takes for the U.S. to win. But our goal has to be, I think, as Margaret said, to build an anti-imperial movement, right? It has to start here. And we ally with other people who are fighting against the U.S. We're not doing it blindly. But we do it to build solidarity here, because if we're going to win here and win what we want here, we have to fight against the military power of the U.S., which is constraining the rest of the world as well.
And I think Peter, you probably started to answer one of the questions. One of our participants said it's rhetorical, but I think it's actually, it's talking about strategy. It's talking about what needs to be done, and it's what will it take for the U.S. to be held accountable? How long will other countries, such as the BRICS members, put up with this?
You can't think about, I mean, you can ask that question, but I think, on my part, this is a question of class struggle, right? I mean, the BRICS countries and their leadership are not the same as the working classes of those countries, right? I mean, the leadership of those countries are willing to put up with the US as long as it makes them a profit. And so, when you look to Brazil, or you look, to Russia or elsewhere, right? I mean, they're willing to cut a deal at the top if it makes them money. It's the rest of us that have to fight for this, right? We have to get out on the streets and struggle, go on strike, organize these movements, cross-border solidarity, because that's what's going to put an end to it. That kind of struggle is what forced the U.S. to leave Vietnam, right, on multiple fronts. And if we're going to have any kind of an impact on American imperialism, it's going to be working class solidarity across the world and fighting on multiple fronts, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. This has to be we have to name it and say that it's class struggle. And that'll be uncomfortable for some people, but it will resonate with many others. And this is and that's going to be a lot mean changing many things that even people who think of themselves as anti-imperialist are going to have to learn. But that's part of our task, class struggle, political education, so that people don't. It bothers me that everything's so Trump centric, and it's hard not to be. He's the president of the United States, and these wacky posts, and he's got dementia. It's hard not to focus on him. But as we both pointed out, a lot of these policies are bipartisan. And when he's no longer president, you might breathe a sigh of relief because there won't be a post on Easter, announcing the planned obliteration of another country. But the class struggle will have to remain. That's why we have this alleged opposition party, which is no such thing, and it has to be exposed, and we have to just start talking about it in just the way that Peter described.
Thank you both. I don't know if you have any other, I mean, those were great summing up comments. If you have anything else, we have a few minutes, but we want to thank everybody for being here. Just again, I'm Gloria Matera, co-chair of the Green Party of New York. We have some information for you at the end. We will share with you. Just want to say that we have some upcoming events happening. As soon as I can share my screen, I will do that. And here we go. Here we go. For those of you who are interested, you can come to Chicago and be in person. And this is our first in-person Green Party annual meeting since before COVID, obviously. And, it's a great place to get to know Greens. You're welcome to register, even if you're not an enrolled Green. So we invite everybody. We're going to have some exciting speakers and events, and you can watch that at our website. And then, of course, going anywhere else. If you are so inclined, you can support the party by becoming a sustainer, making a donation, volunteering. You can do all those things at the Green Party of New York website, gpny.org. And that's a few more upcoming events that will be happening. One is going to be next Tuesday, in fact, where we're having the third part of running for local office. Thank you again. Please follow us on social media and have a great night, everyone.
And thanks to Gloria
Yeah,
for
thank you.
facilitating. Thank you,
Thank you, Gloria.
Gloria.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.